ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, first energetic session after lunch. Please welcome JMac, Jason from United States of America on stage. Boom.
So, as Vishal said, this is talk number 2. I owed you all one from last year, so here it is. We got some code samples that were submitted, and I kind of went through those and cherry-picked about 6 different ones. We're going to go through each one of these kind of starting from 0, and we'll see if we get all the way to 6. But you're going to see some repetition as we go through, because we're going to try to exercise our refactoring muscles. So when I go into some code for the first time, what I like to do is kind of give the code what I call like a first pass. And in this first pass, I want to make sure that the code is, I would say, readable for all developers. So let's kind of see what that means. So let's just go into this code sample here. We have this class. It's a command within Laravel, pretty straightforward. But before I even begin to maybe look at what this class does, I want to, again, give it this first pass. So the first thing I want to do is I want to normalize the code. And to normalize the code, I want to use a code style. If you don't have your own code style, and since we're talking at a Laracon, I'm going to assume Laravel. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to run Pint. This is a first-party package, if you're not familiar. It's built on top PHP CS Fixer. I like it a little bit better than using PHP CS Fixer directly because it has a JSON configuration file instead of a very, very nasty, odd PHP configuration file. And the other nice thing about Pint is it comes with a bunch of default presets, in this case, Laravel's code style. So the code that you're used to looking at as soon as you install or artisan make or maybe use Blueprint, you will see code in that style out of the box. So I just want to be able to quickly apply that code style so I can kind of start to look at the code, but it feels a little more familiar to me. So let's take this dead code. I'm going to copy its path, and we'll just format that 1 bit here. Uh-oh. Why are we not readable? Can you not go oh, there we go. All right, cool. Sorry, Pint seems to not do a subdirectory there. That might be part of my configuration. But anyways, the point here is that this will fix any of the code violations within it. So it's removing unused imports. It's creating the class separation and all those types of things. So if we go back to the code, it'll kind of jump around because PHP Storm's refreshing. But we'll see where, kind of on the sidebar there, we can see that it removed those unused imports. It spaced out all of my properties in kind of a uniform fashion. Now again, this just allows me to look at the code kind of in a normalized way, right? I'm going to talk about why this is important here more in a second. But the next thing I want to do as part of this pass is remove what I call dead code. Dead code's code that's not run or is unreachable. Or has absolutely no value. So let's give it a pass for that. All right, so right here on line 33, no value. This is some old properties, commented out, it's clearly not used. I don't know what it is. Let's just get rid of the noise. Same thing, we're going to keep scrolling down, and you can instantly just get rid of any of that. Look at this whole method here. It's actually got this huge chunk, 28 lines of code there that we can just get rid of. So we've just made this class 30% smaller by simply formatting it and giving it a first pass looking for dead code. This is important because as developers, we may not realize it, we may not want to admit it, but we read code far more than we write code. You're possibly by a multiple of 100 or even 1,000x. This file was over 100 lines when we first started. We haven't even written a line of code yet, but I've read this whole file. So I've already read 100 more lines than I've written. That's actually something that came from Kent Beck in his book Implementation Patterns, and when I realized the truth of that statement, it instantly made me a better developer because you realize the power in this. Whether it's you 6 months from now or another developer on your team, someone's going to come after you and look at this code. Don't make them read all this extra cruft that doesn't even matter when the code is actually run. There's a little bit more we can do here. We can go deeper with dead code. We can go really, really far, actually. We're not going to analyze this code, but you could go so far. But there's one more little thing I want to point out. And there's actually dead code that is uncommented. In this case, this constructor is dead code. All it does is call off to the parent, which is default behavior within any modern programming language. So we can actually remove that and its comment. So look at this, another at least 10 lines there that we can just remove from this class. So again, we've reduced this by 30, 40% already. Even more complicated, one more pass on the dead code, we can actually go through and take a look at this particular try statement. If you see here, we're trying something, and then of course if it passes, we simply exit. But there's nothing that happens below here underneath and handle. So there's kind of no reason to actually exit. We can just get rid of those lines as well. We can keep going farther now. If we look at this code, now that's a little tighter together, we can see that we're just catching exception and we're logging the exception out. Well, Laravel's going to do that for us automatically if you have any kind of exception. It's just going to go into your exception log. So it's possible that that might be okay considering that there's no other lines that happen down here. Or we need to catch that exception to make sure the job completes. Depending on what happens in your code, you may or may not be able to remove that try catch. So just to demonstrate, if you were able to remove it and you could just allow the logging to happen within Laravel because these are the only lines of code that happen in handle, then you could remove that as well. If you need to catch it for a UI or UX, then we would leave it. But the point here is that you can keep going through and find things. There's all sorts of pieces of dead code. Returns inside of switch statements, break statements, using match versus switch. There's dozens and dozens of examples of how you can quickly refactor the code simply by just removing things that are dead or unreachable. So, file number 1. Let's go back, take a look at some other stuff. The next thing I like to do is, now kind of with the second pass, is I like to go through and see if there's any way that I can optimize the code. Again, more towards readability. We're humans, we're not the computer. The computer doesn't care if all the code's on 1 line or 5 lines or whatever. It just parses it and runs it. But again, as humans, we care when we're going through and reading this file. So let's kind of do the same thing. Let's apply our code style. So let's just say 1 in this case. So let's go ahead. Everything we learned before, let's apply the code style. Let's just give it that first pass. I'm going to get rid of this. We know that we're uploading a file. Let's just see if there's any other like really obvious dead code. No obvious dead code, but we can now go through and go into phase 2 of kind of this refactoring bit. So I'm just going to kill these other line breaks. I like to have, I'm an old C developer, I guess, sometimes. And to me, when I have these block of assignments, I just like to see them kind of together. So let's do that. The main thing I want to focus on in this is kind of exactly what the file name says. This is denser code than it really is. And the reason that it feels that way is because as we start scrolling, it's not only really, really long within this if statement, but we start to see right here on line 39 and 40, now we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And we have to think in our minds, again, as humans, we have to track where we are. Okay, at this point in the code, I've branched off, and now we're in a place where it's an AJAX request, and results good, it was true. And tag IDs is not empty. So if, then do line 41. But again, in really, really long blocks of code, that can be a lot to keep track of. So what I like to do is I like to invert these when I can and then return early. So using PHP Storm, we can make this pretty easy. I'm going to do Control-M. That's going to jump to the else branch of this or the other side of that curly brace. And I'm just going to take this, and really, if you start to see this code, all we're really doing is taking this data and we're just carrying that state all the way down, so we return once down here on line 69. And anytime I see that, I know that maybe this developer hasn't learned or embraced the potentials of returning early. So let's do that. I'm going to kill this. We'll take it out. I'm going to go back up to the very, very top, and I'm going to invert it. It's that simple. We just say, see you later, invert that. We've already got the curly brace. Let's bring this back in. So same code moved up to the top. And if we go back down and we take this, we just won't track that variable anymore. We're just going to straight return whatever happens. And it's all closer to the source now. It's much more readable. I call this personally the proximity rule. I like to see whatever I'm doing as close as I can, ideally on the same screen if possible. So now it's easier to read. I don't have to carry that upload through all of that code down to that else branch to see that I'm setting it to this error response, or where status is false with an error message. I can see it right away. Hey, if not upload results, go ahead and give this response. And now everything underneath this, even though it's long code, I've now brought in that indent one more level. All right, so let's keep going. Let's keep applying this. So we'll bring this out some more. We'll take this if else. This has a nested if within the else. Same thing, we're just going to unbreak that. We're going to invert this. and we're going to paste in what we have. And we'll make sure to properly respawn that. So I'm just going to do what I had before, go down to the other side of that, and now we've collapsed yet another one. So again, code's becoming more top level now. Now that I get to this place, I'm actually all the way down at the bottom, and we can do the same thing we've done before. We don't need to carry this data anymore. It's just all right here. So again, with that pass, let's go ahead and format everything one more time with Pint. We'll kind of go back through this again. We can see here now that while this still might be a lengthy method, we're going to learn some tools here in a little bit to kind of help with that. It's much more straightforward. We don't see all of the nesting and that we had before. We're bailing early on. So we're doing the things we need to do here. If that result didn't work out, we're going to return. We're doing some more things here. Again, pretty straightforward assignments. It's a lot of them, but it's no big deal. If the result didn't save, fire that back off. If the file exists, go ahead and unlink it. We could probably collapse that a bit more, but these are so dependent upon one another that they're okay there because they're not, again, nested 3 or 4 levels deep already. And then finally, what we have down here at the bottom. So that's kind of the second pass of nested code. Again, hopefully I'm not changing the code in any way. I'm just giving it another pass that makes it more readable, I think, not only for myself, but hopefully for the team and all other developers. I'd like to think that we all probably feel that this is a bit more readable, right? All right, let's move on. Again, we're at Laracon, so let's do a pass now that's a little more specific to maybe the code or the application that we're using. Okay, so I've done some basic programming stuff at this point. I've styled the code, I've removed dead code, I've unbroken ifs. There's all sorts of little practices that you can do that apply to any programming language. But now I want to give it another pass that's specific to Laravel. How can I make my code look more like the Laravel way, more like what's shown in the documentation, more like what you see in first-party Laravel packages, right? So let's look at this job here. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to kind of see just some quick things we can do. I actually have 2 examples of kind of this step. So these are smaller examples. I'm not going to reapply everything we've learned so far. What I want to point out is really actually in both of these instances a method of dependency injection that, of course, Laravel gives you and uses everywhere. So we can see here in the constructor of this job that they're injecting certain things and assigning it. But we see down here in the handle method that they're actually using more pieces. And this is good. A lot of the times what I see down in here is new, for example, and they actually new up an instance of that. Now, from a testing perspective, that would end up being a little bit hard unless this class does something small and you're testing it in a real integration way. So this is good that they're using resolve because they're pulling it out of the container, but it's not as far as you can get with Laravel. That's still a pretty big block of code that's happening right there. The handle method actually does dependency injection itself. The container will resolve any of your dependencies for you. So we can actually take each one of these lines and bring them up into the handle method itself. So if we just kind of did some fancy string manipulation here, we can see that we can actually inject these through Laravel, and we'd be able to use them directly. So if we do that, it's the same equivalent code, but you're letting Laravel do it instead of you having to write all those assignments and resolving them yourself. Equally testable, so again, it was good that they were using resolve, but just a little bit more of the Laravel way here. All right, let's look at one more example that's a little more powerful. If we look, this is my favorite example. Inside of a controller, the same thing happens. You get automatic injection of the request object, but a lot of times in code I see things like this, where they're pulling off user, or maybe they're doing something like the request object, or in my opinion, inside of a controller, worse yet, they're doing the request facade. There's really no reason to do that in your controller actions, again, because Laravel is injecting that for you. So let's give this a pass for that, and then there's some other things in here I want to point out that are specific to a controller. So Laravel's automatically going to give us the request object inside of any one of our actions, meaning any one of our public methods inside of a controller. That's an action. And with that, we have access to not only request data, but the authorized user. And so here we can simply say request user. So again, same code, but I'm leveraging Laravel more, right? We're writing a Laravel application, so let's use Laravel. This is what's going to be familiar, again, to you or another Laravel developer. So leverage it as much as you can. Let's apply this a little bit more. So same thing down here, anywhere where we have auth. You notice here that they're actually doing that twice. So in this one, there's really no reason not to do it because you've already done that with your form request object. This request object's already available to you. So definitely be using that for consistency. And then down here at the bottom, they don't use anything. So that's good. That's a good pass for that. Let's do another pass with some of the things that we've learned along the way. All right, so if we take a look at this, one thing actually that I see here now is I'm assuming that state being such a simple thing is probably a model, maybe. So I think what I'd like to see here is more like state all, again, because I'm using Laravel. If it's not a model, I would probably quickly make one, to be honest, because it's a pretty straightforward table that seems to exist. What I want to focus on more, I think, for this particular controller is this compact. I've just never been a fan of compact, at least for like passing down view data, and it's because of things like this. We have compact for this single kind of arguably temporary variable. And I'm not really saving anything by using compact. In fact, I had to make a variable to be able to use compact. And I think a lot of people think this is just the way you pass data to templates, but I don't know why. I've never been a fan of it. So let's break this out. And the reason, again, I like breaking this out is because I can actually just set this to, states. All right, and then I can use a little wizardry in PHP Storm, and there. So I've tightened it up in this regard. I've gotten rid of that temporary variable. I've uncompacted compact and expanded that into a true array that I would pass data down into. But it gets rid of that temporary variable, which I think is pretty nice. And we can kind of see the same thing if we keep going down. So let's use what we've learned. Let's get rid of this commented code. And then down here, same thing. In fact, look at this. Consistency, again, they're not using compact here. They were using it above. So again, I just like making that code consistent. So I think this is a good example, because sometimes you see mixed cases where some things use it and some don't. And I just kind of try to apply that consistency, because I think it's very powerful. It lets you get a rhythm when you're reading the code. And now, again, we can just inline that with some PHP Storm magic, and there we go. So again, what was, again, it's not really about the file size per se, but what was a larger file, I think we've broken up and refactored now, again, by just doing these passes where we're not necessarily doing anything that significantly changes the code, but potentially makes it more readable, again, not only as a developer, but now also as that added Laravel developer. Again, no change of behavior, hopefully, but it's all just a little bit cleaner to look at, right? All right, on to the next. All right, the next thing I think we can do, similar along the same lines, building on top of that concepts, are additional kind of streamlines. So let's kind of keep looking at ways we can now, instead of doing things more the Laravel way, this is a little more along the lines of like using kind of that Laravel expressiveness to actually reduce the code. So the first one in this example is this abort statement. I'm a big fan of these. Jess Archer actually turned me on to these, but we have, my fan here is kind of the abort if helper. And instead of having this wrapped inside of that nested code, which we've seen us get rid of before, I can actually pass this as the first argument, and everything else along there is the same, right? So now I have this abort if that condition's true with a 503 with that message, right? So we just took 3 lines of code and we streamlined it down into 1. Previously, we were doing things the Laravel way. It might or might not have saved code. The streamlines in my mind are more about kind of saving code or reducing the lines. All right. We see here again this kind of separate use of the auth helper, so I would go ahead and do request here. Request isn't part of this, so we can always inject it. So we'll say request. All right. And then here, same thing. In this case, it's kind of the opposite. We're actually using a helper to pass in a new job, to dispatch a job. In Laravel 11, this is actually something that you want to be mindful of, because some of these helpers around dispatching jobs have actually been kind of removed. You can put them back in at a controller level, but they're not there for you by default anymore. And so all the more reason to kind of adopt the way in which we're going to refactor this. And what I like to do is kind of use the static dispatch on the job itself. It prevents me from having to do all that extra syntax of newing stuff up, and instead I can just pass in all that data directly. So these two are equivalent, but one's, again, just a little more streamlined. I can not only do it the Laravel way, but I'm actually truly all the time saving code now. I don't have to have the helper wrapper. I don't have to have the new call. This is all equivalent code. Everything else here looks pretty good. Of course, we see the same thing here on dispatch, where we can actually invert this. So we'll pull that out, colon, and unwrap that to do the dispatching. So again, same thing we saw before, where we're shortening the code or kind of giving it that pass to do things more the Laravel way, but again, in this case, shortening or truly reducing it by doing some of the helpers that are available. All right, let's keep going. This is a good one, collections. I'm no Adam Wathan on collections, but let me demonstrate an area and a sure sign to know that you can probably take advantage of collections. So let's just kind of scroll through this one real quick. Well, first of all, we haven't been good stewards, or at least I haven't been demonstrating doing this here. So let's go ahead and run that. All right, there we go. Cool. So we applied our code style, so this is easier to look at, like we learned before. Oh, look at this. PHP Storm's helping me with a little bit of dead code here. This is the default value or argument is ascending, so we can actually get rid of that. Now, going back to collections, here's the sure thing right away. I've done some kind of eloquent query or database builder query. Doesn't really matter. The point is I've queried the database in some regard. I know as a Laravel developer that that query is going to return a collection of some kind. Here's the two signals that you're not taking full advantage of that. First of all, you have a collection method. You're turning it into an array to then call native PHP functions, native array functions in PHP on. The combination of those two is a clear sign to me that you can probably be using some kind of collection method or collection pipeline. So let's do that. We'll leave these on Git. Let's understand what we're doing here. We're really taking the keys and the values, these particular fields. So we've got this field off of that query is going to be the key, and these are going to be the values. And then we're combining those back together to make them a key-valued array, right? That's what array combined does. So we're pulling off a column on a set of array or an associative array. We're doing that twice and then combining it back together. Okay, in my mind, knowing a bit of the collection methods, if not, you could scroll the documentation page on collections and find something that'll do this. I know that this is pluck. So the first argument to pluck is the value. So I just pass that in. And the second argument is the keys. So we see here actually PHP Storm helping us out again. So the value and the key. All right, I've taken care of those two lines simply by doing that. Okay, we don't need to combine them anymore because that's exactly what pluck does for us, which means that we can get rid of that and we can simply return this value. Beautiful. So I get a single line function now, or method. That's not exactly always the goal, but the point here is that I'm using what Laravel gives me all the way down. I think that's really, really nice, right? I don't have kind of Laravel code mixed with that PHP code. I think that's pretty cool to be able to take advantage again of what Laravel has already given me, and instead of putting it back in something that, sure, I might be familiar with, I'm pushing, again, the limits and leveraging Laravel as much as I can. Let's do this maybe one more time, because this one's, this one's not as clear. So let's take a minute and try to go through this. I've got just a bit longer here. All right, so we'll take weeks. Let's get rid of this to array, and let's kind of understand what we're really doing here. Okay, same kind of thing. We're getting array column. We're combining those back together, and then we're reversing that. So let's at least do this with this first section. So same thing, pluck. We saw that already. So we're going to pluck the values, or count, and the keys or date. So we can get rid of those two lines. Don't need to combine it because that's what pluck does. And now we're actually going to reverse it. Don't need to do that anymore. Dead code. All right, so now we're taking array keys and we're mapping those. We're reversing a mapping of this. Okay, so this is actually a completely separate variable that we need. So let's try to do this. Weeks now, we don't need to get array keys. Weeks is still a collection because we haven't to-rated anymore. So now we can say something like keys to get all those, and let's see if we can take care of this array map. So most of the methods inside of collections are really just the same name, just without the array prefix. So we can say map, and we can just simply copy this in there. We don't need to try to get fancy and do anything else. We can just copy the code. So this should be functionally equivalent to the code we had before. The next thing we're doing with chart labels is we're imploding it. We're imploding it with like, okay, we're wrapping things inside of quotes here, it looks like. All right, so I can use join for that. So we'll just take the same glue that they use. So that gets rid of that line. And now we actually have a string, which is good. And ultimately, we're returning a tuple here of those two things, okay? So we don't need implode anymore. I'm not sure if join gives you back a stringable, and I'm not going to tempt the internet right now, but there might be something like that. And if not, that might be a plane ride home PR. We'll see. All right. Anyway, to finish this up, this is equivalent to what we had before, and remember, weeks was still a collection, so the original method intended to turn an array. So there we go. This is back to where we were before, but again, nice and clean, 2 blocks of things now instead of kind of mixing and matching Laravel code, then back to PHP arrays, then back to collections again. We kind of see all this built together here, and we could tighten this up more if we wanted to, you know, with arrow functions and so forth. But I think this is a pretty good example of how you can refactor code to use collections. And the 2 clear signs are when you're heavily using to array or all simply to be able to use the native PHP array functions. So if you ever see that, push yourself and see if you can do collections. All right, I'm getting a little low on time here. Let's talk about one last thing, and I'm going to get a drink real fast. Let's talk about testing. Really, Michael Feathers would say that legacy code is any untested code, and technically speaking, I can't truly refactor any of these things without first having a test. So we've been winging it because I'm on stage here and only have 30 minutes, so we haven't written a test. But one of the submissions asked not so much to refactor this, but how would I go about testing this policy in isolation? And anytime I think about that, testing something in isolation, I immediately think of a unit test, a traditional test. Laravel is very big on integration tests, and that's great. The framework provides you with this HTTP testing layer and this integrated testing layer that's so easy to use that I do prefer it. But always remember that you can test things in isolation with a simple unit-style test. So let's take the time I have left real quick and just write a few test methods for this, just to get a feel for a true refactoring process of so you have test first, you have tested code first. All right, so let's do make test, and I'm going to say unit. And this is a policy, so I'll say policies, and then this is a user policy. So user policy test. All right, so artisan, did I type something wrong? Oh, this is why I've had the problem all along. I was in the demo folder. There we go. All right, let's go back. There it is. All right, cool. All right, so we go to this user policy test. There's nothing in here right now. Let's just bring these up side by side. Okay, so I'm just going to test these first 2 real quick with the time I have left. Only have a few minutes. So let's change this example here. We'll say view any, and we'll say returns true. It always returns true, so let's just make sure it returns true. So we'll say subject. This is just testing terminology. I like to simply just say subject. The subject under test. And we just new up. This is a very, very simple class. Don't be afraid that it's a Laravel class, right? It's a policy class. If we look, there's nothing that it extends. There's no dependency injection or any kind of container magic that's happening for us. This is the class just like anything else. So I should be able to test it by just calling its methods directly, as I would any other PHP object. So I just simply make the object, and now I'm going to call its methods. So instead of asserting true is true here, even though these are kind of the same type of test, we can now say view any. The challenge maybe now is that notice this isn't necessarily a nullable thing. It actually accepts a user. This is where we kind of mix the best of both worlds. So let me get rid of this import for a PHP unit test case. Let's import a class, import Laravel's test case, which is going to give us a bit of that integration layer. And now I can say use refresh database, which means I can use factories and have them persisted into the database during my test. So we'll say user equals user factory. I don't really need it to the database, so in fact, I can just say make here, and now we satisfy these little squiggly lines that PHP Storm's telling me. So if we were to go and run this test, I would expect to see that it passed. So that's how I would test this very simple method, but of course, it's only returning true. So let's see if we can write one more here real quick. I'm going to go just a few minutes over to get this example complete. So let's change this to view returns true. So let's look at this. We have a little bit of complexity here in this if statement. It's still a single line, but there's some things going on here. So let's test what we kind of know here. This one's pretty simple. If the same user IDs are passed in, then this would return true. Okay, good. So let's change this to view. And really what I would expect here, those are IDs, which means they need to be in the database. So let me just change this to create. And really, theoretically, I can make that pass by simply just passing in the same user, right? Because the same user is going to have the same user ID. Now that could reveal a bug in your code, that could not. This is why testing is wonderful, but that's going to satisfy this condition. This isn't completely tested though. If you ran some kind of code coverage, you would see that only this section's highlighted. So let's do this too. Let's write the last test here. Let's do that. Let's bring this across. And now to make sure that this is passing in the right way, let's change our name to make PHP happy. So let's say view returns true when user has permission. All right, I'm going to duplicate this. And to just kind of demonstrate what we're doing here, I'm simply going to call this another user. Maybe in the real world that matters. Now again, I don't have access to this entire application, so I don't really know what it means to have that particular ability. So let's just say that maybe there's a flag in your database that has to happen, right? Like there's some kind of simple manage users flag to true. Whatever this is in your code, I would set up that user to have that ability. But the point is that the other user is two things. One, they do not have that ability, and two, they're not the same user. So again, I want to test that in isolation. So if I do this, I would expect that to pass. So I got a red light here that says my time's up. So let me just kind of finish on this real quick. Basically, ending on the test for a very important reason. If you're truly going to refactor your code, you should really attempt to write a test for it. I understand that testing takes a little extra time. I understand that testing can be hard and daunting at first. But we can see here that even simple classes really can be tested, in isolation. You don't have to worry about learning like the entire framework bit. But if you don't have time to test, try that past approach that we saw before, where you're really just minimally changing things. You're trying your best not to rewrite code, right? Don't go in and make it the code the way you want it. Refactoring, true refactoring, should be either adding tests or making the code ideally more readable for the developer behind you. Because again, we read code far more than we write code. So I'll leave it at that.
Hello, hello. Okay, thanks, Jason.
Yep.
I have a couple of questions, but we'll ask only one question. So the question is, what do you think about using named parameters? Good practice? Should we use it just for methods with more parameters?
Yeah, I definitely have embraced name parameters in the last, I would say, year. I think initially it seemed like extra typing to me, especially when things weren't necessarily optional. But I think if you look at Laravel itself, especially a lot of the new things you saw in prompts, you also see it in kind of first-party Laravel things like Livewire. They're doing a lot more named parameters. And so I do think that's the future way to be doing it.
Yeah, perfect. Like there are a few more questions as well, but like one of the question was about like you having like 25 years of experience working with PHP.
Old man JMac.
Yeah. So they were saying like, don't you feel sometimes to change the programming language, or don't you feel sometimes to quit programming and do something else? So how do you inspire yourself?
I don't know. I think I've stuck with PHP. I mean, I've written other languages for a little while, and I've always just come back to PHP. I like it. I don't know if it's because kind of the first language that I was empowered with, because when I was younger and started, and I've just kind of grown with the language.
Yeah.
And I think to me that's what's helped along the way. But I just have a curious and kind of analytical mind, so I love programming.
So you must have worked with like core PHP during
Oh
like 90s.
yeah, old.
Those templates, those CSS files. And then after, did you use any other frameworks before you worked in Laravel?
I used Cake PHP for a little while.
Cake PHP,
It was okay. I think the best one I used probably before Laravel would have been Rails. I was a Ruby developer for a couple years. So.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool.
Thank you, Jason.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, yeah.